The United States was the first nation to develop nuclear weapons. However, these weapons were gravity bombs dropped by strategic bombers like the B-29 Superfortress and later the modern-day B-52 Stratofortress or Russian unlicensed versions of said aircraft. Russia has an advantage in the ICBM category, and did when Russia developed the world's first. That missile was the R-7, aka the Soyuz rocket. The Soyuz absurdly large 3,000 kilogram warhead required an equally stout rocket system to get it all the way to America.
The Soyuz was designed to take the longest flight path to the US, taking it well into outer space. The Soyuz utilizes a process known as rocket staging. Rocket staging is a technique used in rocket design to discard empty fuel tanks and other unnecessary components during the rocket's ascent. This helps reduce the overall weight of the rocket as it gains altitude, allowing for more efficient use of fuel and higher payload capacities. The Soyuz rocket has 4 liquid-fueled strap-on boosters, arranged in a square configuration around the central core stage. These boosters are ignited at liftoff and provide additional thrust during the initial phase of the launch. The boosters burn for about 118 seconds before separating from the core stage. The core stage, also known as the second stage, is a single liquid-fueled rocket engine. After the boosters separate, the core stage continues to burn. The core stage separates from the payload once the core stage's propellant is depleted. One of the beauties of the Soyuz is that the boosters don't just lazily fall away when separated. A burst of gas at the tip actually pushes the booster out from the rocket in a backflip maneuver. And when this is synchronized across the 4 side boosters, they end up tumbling down in a perfect cross formation. This is known as the Korolev cross, named after Sergei Korolev, an engineer who worked on the Soyuz. Very cool. The engines are the inventions of Valentin Glushko, who had a long-time rivalry with his colleague Sergei Korolev. Looking at the Soyuz, it would appear that each booster contained 4 engines, but that's not the case. The Soyuz had one single rocket engine with 4 nozzles for each booster. So why was it designed this way? Was it a cost-cutting decision? No, it was not. The logistics of synchronizing multiple engines together can be very challenging. The Sentinel and the Soyuz come at the problem from different angles. The Sentinel has one engine with 1 large nozzle for each booster. The Soyuz minimizes number of engines and maximizes the number of nozzles. One single rocket engine with 4 nozzles for each booster. The Soyuz was the right missile for the wrong time. Unlike the Sentinel, China's and Russia's nukes can maneuver on their own at hypersonic speeds during their descent to Earth without the rocket body that is necessary during the ascent. However, in 1957, this was not possible, and getting the warhead to come back down to Earth and come back down in the right spot was a challenge. Russia was also concerned with their missiles being destroyed on the launch pad, since any launch site is pretty much a known location. Russia made the decision to go with more mobile launch vehicles instead to avoid this. Today, superior American spy satellites have eroded any advantage mobile launched vehicles had, and all Russian nuclear launch vehicles are tracked 24/7 by the United States. Missiles launched from vehicles also suffered from needing to be limited in size in order to fit on the vehicle. The Soyuz became the vehicle for Prosteshi Sputnik 1, Prosteshi Sputnik 2, Prosteshi Sputnik 3, Luna 1, Luna 2, Luna 3, and Tiazeli Sputnik 7, the type that went to Venus. I don't have enough information to talk about all the Russian spacecraft launched by the Soyuz, but these are the few my source talks about cited in the pinned comment. Sputnik was a polished metal sphere, a little less than 2 feet in diameter, with 4 radio antennas sticking out. This outraged Americans, and eventually led to the creation of the Space Force, announced by the Honorable Mike Pence.
Space is essential to our nation's security, prosperity, and our very way of life. Last year, after it had lain dormant for nearly a quarter century, President Trump revived the National Space Council to reinvigorate and coordinate space activities across our government. It's my great honor as Vice President to serve as the Chairman of the National Space Council. That space is, in his words, a war-fighting domain just like land and air and sea. And just as we've done in ages past, The United States of America, under his leadership, will meet the emerging threats on this new battlefield with American ingenuity and strength to defend our nation, protect our people, and carry the cause of liberty and peace into the next great American frontier. In 1939, at the start of the Second World War, the U.S. Army Air Corps was still a fledgling organization. But as Nazi air forces bombed their way from Warsaw to London, our military commanders took decisive action then to meet that new threat head on. By 1945, the American military had nearly 30 times the number of planes and 85 times the number of pilots and support crews compared to just 6 years earlier. Now, to be clear, the Space Force will not be built from scratch, because the men and women who run and protect our nation's space programs today are already the best in the world. Since the dawn of the space age, America has remained the best in space. At the direction of Secretary Mattis, the Department of Defense is fielding a new generation of jam-resistant GPS and communication satellites, and new missile warning satellites that are smaller, tougher, and more maneuverable than ever before. It is not enough to merely have an American presence in space. We must have American dominance in space, and so we will. What was once peaceful and uncontested is now crowded and adversarial. Today, other nations are seeking to disrupt our space-based systems and challenge American supremacy in space as never before. For many years, nations from Russia and China to North Korea and Iran have pursued weapons to jam, blind, and disable our navigation and communication satellites via electronic attacks from the ground. But recently, our adversaries have been working to bring new weapons of war into space itself. In 2007, China launched a missile that tracked and destroyed one of its own satellites, a highly provocative demonstration of China's growing capability to militarize space. Russia's been designing an airborne laser to disrupt our space-based system, and it claims to be developing missiles that can be launched from an aircraft mid-flight to destroy American satellites. Both China and Russia have been conducting highly sophisticated on-orbit activities that could enable them to maneuver their satellites into close proximity of ours, posing unprecedented new dangers to our space systems. Both nations are also investing heavily in what are known as hypersonic missiles, designed to fly up to 5 miles per second at such low altitudes that they could potentially evade detection by our missile defense radars. In fact, China claimed to have made its first successful test of a hypersonic vehicle just last week. China and Russia are also aggressively working to incorporate anti-satellite attacks into their warfighting doctrines. In 2015, China created a separate military enterprise to oversee and prioritize its warfighting capabilities in space. As their actions make clear, our adversaries have transformed space into a warfighting domain already, and the United States will not shrink from this challenge.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome General Jay Raymond, Acting Secretary of Defense Christopher Miller, Secretary of the Air Force Barbara Barrett, and the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence.
Since the dawn of the space age, the United States has long understood that access to space and freedom to maneuver in space underwrites our economy, our passion for science and exploration, and our national security. Recognizing that this vital national interest could no longer be taken for granted, the United States elevated space inside of the Department of Defense to a level commensurate with its importance to our nation. Special thanks to Vice President Pence for hosting today's ceremony. Sir, we can't thank you.
Don't tell anybody. My only dream when I was growing up was to join the Air Force and become an astronaut. And clearly my parents cursed me with bad genes, and I had to get these things disqualifying me. But today, I had to end up going into the Army and being a ground pounder. But today, you know, it really marked an important step forward in deterring the threats posed by our strategic competitors, ones that extend beyond traditional warfighting domains. It was necessary to step in this area. It was a necessary step in this area of great power competition that we're in now, marked by revisionist powers, fielding new weapons that put our satellites and space-based systems at risk. And it was a recognition of the importance of securing freedom of operation in what is now a highly contested environment, space. Additionally, we are incredibly grateful to the Vice President for his leadership of the National Space Council. That's game changing. Getting that thing going again, Vice President, and your leadership of that was transformative. And none of this would have happened without you just leaning in on this and just pushing so hard. His advocacy on behalf of our armed forces, and I see, most people don't see this regularly. I see it all the time. The leadership of the Vice President, his care, his compassion for our men and women in uniform and their families is remarkable. Your advocacy on behalf of our armed forces and a new generation of space professionals continues to make us stronger, safer, and more secure as we maintain American superiority in the ultimate high ground. Mr. Vice President, I'm going off script again, I know, but I just want to personally thank you. We've been through some stuff. We've gone through some of the most complex military operations this country's ever conducted, and your steady hand and your leadership during those was a great source of strength for me. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your character. Thank you for your selfless service. Thank you for commitment. Thank you for being a mentor to me, Mr. Vice President. And with that, the floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you all for being here today. To Acting Secretary of Defense Chris Miller, to the Secretary of the Air Force Barbara Barrett, to General John Hyten, General Jay Raymond, General James Dickinson, General David Thompson, and General David Alvin. The idea, though, and its conception was not a new one. For more than 50 years, presidents and military leaders had discussed a branch of our military dedicated to ensuring American national security in and from space, but time and again, those efforts faltered. And the Space Force is growing stronger every day, and just in the nick of time. I think every one of the military leaders here knows that space is a vacuum, but we're not operating in a vacuum. The space race began in the 1950s, and it continues today. That space is a warfighting domain. And it's imperative that we invest the resources and the personnel and the technology to defend our nation and defend our values in the outer reaches of space. In fact, the United States, as you've heard already, faces emerging threats in space from countries like China and Russia, and those threats are only growing. We were reminded of that just this week when Russia conducted yet another anti-satellite missile launch to defend America and defend our freedom from space. We seek peace through strength. And I want to say to the men and women of the United States Space Force, I've comes to the outer reaches of space, you are that strength. To announce that henceforth, the men and women of the United States Space Force will be known as Guardians. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Guardians will be defending our nation for generations to come. So with that announcement, let me just say thank you again. You will serve with confidence and gratitude of the American people. And I'm also convinced that those of you that will serve in the United States Space Force in this generation and generations to come will also go with the prayers of millions of Americans who will claim that ancient verse that promises that if you rise on the wings of the dawn, if you settle on the far side of the sea, even if you go up to the heavens, that there his hand will guide you and his right hand will hold you fast. That then will be our prayer for our guardians in this generation and for generations to come. So happy birthday to the United States Space Force. God bless our guardians. God bless all the members of our armed forces. And God bless America.
The new Soyuz vehicle, from which the Soyuz rocket gets its name, was designed for the next generation of space exploration. It was significantly larger and more capable than any crew capsule they had made before. With this vehicle, the Russians could extend the duration of their low Earth orbit missions, dock the other vehicles, and dock to future space stations. In 2000, Soyuz commander Yuri Gitsin docked the Soyuz vehicle to the International Space Station with the U.S. Navy SEAL astronaut William Shepard and cosmonaut Sergei Krikalev, those three being the first crew to aboard the International Space Station.
Different variants of the Soyuz rockets have launched over 1,900 times, making it by far the most used vehicle in the history of spaceflight. In 2011, when Obama and then Vice President Joe Biden discontinued all American spacecraft, the only way our astronauts could reach the ISS to do their job was through the Russian-owned Soyuz rocket, and many NASA employees were fired to fund SpaceX, owned by Elon Musk. And in case you were wondering why high-speed rail never made it to the US, Obama giving money to Elon Musk was also the reason for that, coincidentally.
President Barack Obama's $3.8 trillion budget, while astronomical and compared to previous plans, aims to spend wisely and keep those funds closer to Earth.
It's time to save what we can, spend what we must, and live within our means once again.
How much less is a big question for NASA, and despite the demise of the Moon program, the agency is getting a 1.5% increase from 2009. Much of that funding will target projects closer to home, including the launch of new Earth observation satellites, which will help to monitor climate change. Obama's budget promises a bold new course for human spaceflight, but provides no details such as where astronauts would go, in what ship, or by when.
Jim, after 2 months of competing plans, protest, and debate, the president says the debate is over. He's putting his goals into an official United States policy on space, a policy that puts United States astronauts on Russian rockets. It's the idea that Russia will be the only nation launching people to the space station that is making spaceflight such a battleground right now. Legendary astronaut John Glenn says, keep flying the shuttle. Senator Bill Nelson and many others on Capitol Hill say the U.S. should start developing a giant new rocket right away. The president's goals outlined today in the newly released policy are to expand international cooperation, working with other countries to explore space, and to invest in and nurture the space industry. By space industry, the president does not mean workers currently in it, such as the thousands working on the shuttle in Florida, Alabama, Texas, and other states. They're being laid off. The president means new companies, such as SpaceX, which just launched its new Falcon 9 rocket from the Cape.
Sentinel is slowly going to replace the aging but effective Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles. Sentinel serves as a deterrent to potential adversaries, sending a message of, look, we have a fairly modern and capable ICBMs, so don't get brazen with your nuclear arsenal or you will have to deal with ours. But the key word there is fairly modern and capable. And that's the controversial bit. For all its cost, which is likely to be upward of $100 billion just to procure all the missiles and upward of $250 billion to operate them over 50 years, the US is not really getting a superbly capable, better than anything else kind of system. Instead, all that money is merely buying a mediocre ICBM that's in some ways behind other countries' ICBMs. Even today, let alone 2030, when it's supposed to become operational.
Not to mention some of the advantages of older systems used in the Soyuz missile and Minuteman III are lost in Sentinel, which is not compatible with older launch command and control systems. And by command and control systems, I mean underground copper wires and other analog systems. Essentially, if you want to hack one of these older missiles, you'd have to dig up these heavily monitored copper wires and splice them with your own. You must do this undetected, matching the existing nature of the wires exactly without disrupting the system. Compare that to the systems used in the Sentinel, which really only requires some more powerful computers, not like laptops, like those huge refrigerator-sized computers. Then the computers used to control the Sentinel. That and a great deal of knowledge. Not knowledge that I have. This is just something I learned from an interview with Tom Caraco, Senior Fellow with the International Security Program, and the Director of the Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
The Sentinel was constrained by the design requirement that it fit inside the same missile silos that were designed for the Minuteman III. That means that optimally, the Sentinel should be the same size as the Minuteman III or smaller. However, the Sentinel is believed to be slightly larger, although exact dimensions haven't been disclosed. The Sentinel will nominally field only one warhead, like the Soyuz missile, but could carry a maximum of 3. The similar-sized Russian Yars missile can carry a maximum of 6 warheads. This is because the Sentinels carry the W-89 warhead, which is smaller than the Soyuz's warhead. The W-89 warhead's explosive yield was described as disappointing by this one website I found.
I'm not mad. I'm just disappointed.
As far as range goes, the chemistry of rocket motors can only improve so much. And in fact, it did not really revolutionize in these last 50 years. The Sentinel is designed so that the fuel doesn't have to be replaced as often as a cost-cutting measure. Initially, cost projections for the Sentinel projects were somewhat reasonable back in 2015. Total cost to develop and procure missiles and to put them in service was some $62 billion. But that figure rose very quickly, just a year later in 2016. U.S. Air Force Secretary Frank Handel said inflation assumptions and defense industry ability to produce the missiles are major sources of cost uncertainty. An $85 billion price tag placeholder was given out as an estimate. In order to keep costs down, the U.S. did not want to develop new technologies for the system. Program manager Colonel Heath Collins said his team looked long and hard at the state of the industry today and found technology that already meets requirements. So the Sentinel will be integrating existing technologies. Now, initially, Boeing and Northrop Grumman were competing for the chance to lead development on this new missile. But in July of 2019, Northrop Grumman went ahead and just bought Boeing's engine supplier, Orbital ATK. Orbital ATK itself had bought many other smaller rocket motor developers earlier, including 2 out of the 3 makers of rocket motors that worked on the Minuteman III. This was purely a tactic to force Boeing out of the competition, as Northrop Grumman opted not to use Orbital ATK for their motors, and instead farmed that work out to Aerojet Rocketdyne. This is unfortunate, as Aerojet Rocketdyne lacks large-diameter solid fuel rocket motor experience. It specializes in liquid fuel rocket motors, which are suboptimal for ICBMs.
Head of Air Force Global Strike Command, Colin Connor, said that Northrop and the Air Force continued to refine the cost estimates, admitting that initial estimates were likely too low. Andrew Hunter, Air Force's acquisition chief, said we're in a different world now than when program costs and schedules were set. Even without the re-entry vehicle and warhead costs, it's looking like Sentinel will easily go over $100 billion. It's just too bad that the system itself seems to be warmed over tech from the past years. For the money spent, Sentinel could have and perhaps should have been a bigger step in capability compared to other missiles.
If you enjoyed the video, I challenge you to indicate as much by pressing the like button. Be sure you're subscribed, and thank the people who worked on this video in the comments section.